Chao. I direct the Center for Asian American Christianity. And today we have my colleague, friend, and guest, Dr. Easten Law, who is Associate Director of the Overseas Ministry Study Center. Easten, welcome.
Thank you very much, David. Great to be here.
Today we're going to talk about some of these themes that you have been reflecting on and doing research and publishing in for many, many years. So it's really a privilege for me to enter into conversation with you, Easten, on the topic of migration and global Christianity. And I thought, since that is a massive topic, we could begin with a more narrow entry point. I want to think more about our conference almost a year ago, Multiple Belongings in Transpacific Christianities, which you helped me to organize, taking migration as a particular theme to situate Transpacific Asian experiences and identity. The mental health conference this past year looked at intergenerational family life as a kind of effect of migration, especially for Asian migrants to the U.S., and how that generates or creates the conditions for the mental health issues that Asian American families and churches struggle and grapple with. And we have our International Bulletin of Mission Research special issue coming out this summer. So maybe we could just begin there and you could give our audience a little bit of an overview of what to expect with this special issue.
Absolutely. Well, the Overseas Ministry Study Center has published the International Bulletin of Mission Research, the IBMR for short, for decades now, and it's been at the cutting edge of mission studies and world Christianity for some time. It's a quarterly journal, which means there's a lot of editing involved from month to month, and so it's really been a joy to be able to work with you, David, on this collection of articles that were birthed from our conference around Transpacific Asian Christianity and the multiple belongings that come with that. And so I would say that at the crux of this special issue and this sort of larger research inquiry or journey that we're on is this idea that as Christians, we have to negotiate multiple senses of belonging, right? It doesn't matter if you where you're from. I think if you take into account the realities of nation, ethnicity, culture, globalization, migration, we all have a sense of belonging to multiple places. And sometimes those places and those senses of belonging are in conflict. Sometimes they come together in very cohesively. And what does Christian faith have to do with all of that, right? And in particular, what does it mean for Asians and Asian Americans who have migrated across the Pacific from Asia to North America for a multiple, diverse set of reasons, right? And how does Christian faith, what role does Christian faith play in that journey? And what does it say about God and human relationships to God and to one another?
Fantastic. Help our audience appreciate this broader intersection of themes between migration and world Christianity. And I'll put some of the relevant context here, because I know that Peter Fan, your supervisor at Georgetown, he is a major scholar of religion who focused on migration as a theological motif even. And so you cut your teeth on some of these themes much earlier in your training with Peter Fan. I'm also looking at this fantastic book. Do you want to say the title and author's name for us here?
Jihu Hanselis, or rather, Jihu Hansels, one of his newest texts, Migration and the Making of Global Christianity.
So for our audience, this big blue book, Easten turned me on to, and I find it to be a really groundbreaking study of this topic of our podcast of migration and world Christianity. So maybe connect our conference last year and our publication with IBMR to some of these broader discussions happening in the world Christianity field at the intersection with migration.
Sure thing. Well, world Christianity is inherently a multidisciplinary sort of space. And that means people approach even a common subject through different disciplinary lenses. As you mentioned, I worked with Peter Fan, who is a Catholic theologian, and so my approach to migration has, in some ways, been shaped theologically by Peter Fan. Um, Dr. Jihu Hansels, he's a historian by trade, worked under Andrew Walls, and therefore his newest text on migration and the making of global Christianity takes a more historical approach to the subject, specifically on how migration has shaped the realities of the global church, and how migration is in many ways fundamental to the church's expansion, the church's Christianity's adoption across many faiths, that it's not a story of power from above imposing faith, but it's a story of people moving and naturally, with that movement, bringing Christianity with them. And when Christianity arrives in other places, that Christianity being changed and transformed by those places.
I want to bring in some of my own particular research interests. As you know, I've submitted for our special issue my article called The 1517 Project and World Christianity. And I use migration as a metaphor to expand our imagination beyond Anglo-European Christendom categories to look at the global context where Jesus is confessed as Lord across space and time. And so while migration occurs for European Christians, especially as they settled in the U.S. as pilgrims, famously on the eastern seaboard, migration goes beyond simply that Anglo-European context. So maybe you could say a little bit of the post-colonial perspective in world Christianity, how it seeks to perhaps balance the conversation about Christianity and Christian theology within a broader global context rather than simply an Anglo-European context, and how migration supports that type of reframing.
Well, Andrew Walls and Lamin Sanneh, who are considered some of the founding figures in world Christianity as a perspective and multidisciplinary lens for the study of Christianity, were keen on this idea of the translatability of the gospel, and that when Christianity moves from one place to another, it changes, right? And how does it change? It changes in response to the needs on the ground. And so even if Christianity was brought to other countries or other parts of the world by European colonialists, you could say, under what you would call a Christendom mindset, this power from high above, once it gets into the hands of local Christians, these local Christians get to reshape that faith in ways that are most relevant for them. And part of the story of what Jihu Hansels is talking about in his text is that when you look at the spread of Christianity anywhere, the real factors, the real pushers are really the indigenous Christians, right? It's the local Christians that once they take on this identity, they reshape it, they reinterpret it, and they translate it in ways that are dynamically important to local needs that the original missionaries might not have even originally imagined. And that's a really, really powerful thesis, because what it means is Christianity belongs to can belong to many different places in many different ways, and that we can all be a part of the story in different ways and still at the same time be part of one church.
That's a great point. I want to keep in our imagination this theme of indigenous faith, because I think it's going to be important throughout this podcast conversation. But I want to drill down into an area of specificity that you know quite a bit about: Christianity in China. I know you're working on your first book manuscript pertaining to Christianity in China. So let's drill down from this broader theme of migration, the movement of people, as well as the Christian faith that is translated across space and time, that takes contextual root in an indigenous context. And for for the next part of our conversation, let's talk about the indigenous context of China and your area of research. Maybe just give us a big picture view on what your forthcoming book will examine in particular. And I do want to talk about ethnography and oral history at the end of this piece.
Sure thing. Well, my research is contemporary China, so I'm not looking at the history of Christianity in China. I'm looking at Christianity in China as it currently exists, as it's currently expressed, and so that's a little bit different than the historical work in world Christianity that has really set the stage for the translatability of the gospel, the sense of belonging that the gospel can foster when it's indigenized. And what I've found is, because I'm working with contemporary Chinese Christians, my tools aren't the archives. My tools are ethnographic in nature, participant observation, qualitative research writ large, things like interviews, semi-structured, things of that sort. And what I think there's an assumption behind the method is that with each generation, particularly in the context of China, Christianity has to be translated anew. Because in the context of China, every decade has been dramatically different than the last.
Interesting.
If you think about the history, what they sometimes will say the long 20th century of China, from the colonial period to independence, a loose, fragile independence, through wars, through when the Communist Party, took the reins of China, through the Maoist era, through the opening up and reform period, to contemporary times. Every 1 to 2 decades, China is experiencing a different upheaval, which means that the Christians in that context are thinking about what their faith means to them in that context, right? And so, in order to really understand how Chinese Christians feel a sense of belonging to the church today, you have to go directly to them. And so what I did is I spent time in the Shanghai region, also in the Hong Kong region, and I interviewed Chinese Christians about their everyday life experience, and as Christians, and how and when and how they felt the presence of God with them. What were the markers of the presence of God, and how does your experience of God's presence translate into your everyday living, whether it's in the workplace, relationships with family or friends. I wanted to know how faith is expressed in the context of their lives, and so I've adopted the term "live theology" as a way to capture this sort of interest. And so the book that I'm working on now, the monograph, is entitled sort of something along the lines of an experiment in live theology and world Christianity with Chinese Christians, how they deal with their own lives, but also from a bigger picture of how they're dealing with the multiple changes that have taken place in China.
That's awesome. So you've put on the table for this conversation this word ethnography and this phrase lived theology, in particular with reference to Christianity in China. Can you just define ethnography for us and explain what it is as a method in your particular study, but also more broadly within world Christianity as a discourse? Because it's getting a lot of airtime, and people might be curious about what it is and why it's useful.
Right. Well, the term ethnography itself you can break it down into two specific parts, right? Ethno, or ethnos, meaning culture, and graphy, which is common in sort of academic language as the writing of, right? So ethnography literally means the writing of culture. And so there's a sense of, well, so inherent in the word ethnography is a kind of translation taking place, actually. The ethnographer has to go into a culture, observe, experience, understand the rhythms, the concerns, the values, the expressions of a culture, and then they have the task of writing it down for somebody else to read, for somebody else to learn about a culture that they're unfamiliar with, perhaps.
So this comes out of anthropology.
This comes out of anthropology. So ethnography is a method that was pioneered by anthropologists in particular. But I will say they was pioneered during a time when it was presupposed that cultures were somewhat independent of one another. That one person from one culture could go into the jungle and engage with an untouched culture of another one, and then it was the ethnographer that bridged them. And in this day and age, that's no longer the case, and for the most part. Uh, the world is globalized, cultures are uh, hybridized, people are moving, information is moving, and cultures are mixing together all the time. So ethnography has taken on a different tone in today's era, and I think it's been adopted by world Christianity scholars. There's more and more ethnographies being conducted by scholars of the world church because it is a way to really look at the the particularities of the world church in its diversity, right? Instead of thinking, oh, Christianity is one church and that church everywhere is going to obviously be the same because they're all Christian, there's this assumption that no, in different places, Christianity can be very different. And hence, there is a segment of world Christianity scholars that even they'll trend toward the plural. They would prefer the term world Christianities. And that's where ethnography plays into a case because they're really trying to dig deep into the distinctions of Christianity in each place, what it's addressing, how it's expressed, et cetera, et cetera.
So ethnography helps us to give a thicker description of the plural expressions of Christianity, its diversity in its local context. How does that help your interest in lived theology?
Right. And so this is a different segment of my research that I really had to work hard to piece together because generally speaking, theologians aren't trained to think about qualitative research. They're not trained to think about ethnography. They're trained to work with texts and systematic sort of reasoning, things of that sort. And so, and in the same way, I was initially trained in this way, but it just wasn't ringing my bell, for lack of a better word. I always questioned what was the relevance of this type of theological inquiry if it feels disconnected from the way people are living their lives. So I turned to lived religion as a discipline within the sociology of religion, and sort of methods that were spearheaded in congregational studies, which has some close affinity with practical theology. And so for me to work on lived theology was in some ways to take seriously one of the corners of what Methodists would call the Wesleyan quadrilateral, right? To give some systematic methodological rigor to this category of experience, right? Because within the Methodist tradition, they'll say, where does theology come from? It comes from Scripture. That's one side of the square. It comes from church history and the tradition. It comes from reason and logic. But experience is one of those four things. And in my experience of theological inquiry, ironically, experience wasn't given the weight that it could be. And so this is why I've sort of turned to lived theology as a means to, like you said, thicken an understanding of people's experiences as a source for theology and put that into dialogue with these other, perhaps more developed segments of the theological academy around church history, systematics, and it's sort of my sense that lived experiences are it's about time they're given their due.
That sounds fascinating. I want to poke around this topic of conversion, especially as it pertains to foreign missionaries in places such as South Asia, East Asia, Africa, Latin America. So we have European and U.S.-based missionaries. They are sharing the Christian faith across the cultural divide. And I'm curious as to what ethnography might provide from the ground up perspective. So let me kind of illustrate. Let me take a little bit longer to set the table here. So I'm preparing, as you know, Easten, for my paper in Hong Kong on Chinese Christianity, and I'm looking at the Presbyterian Missionary Archives, both in Philadelphia, but we have a huge amount of archival sources here. So shout out to Brian Shetler of Special Collections. And I'm digging into the Spear collection. And I'm looking at that 1920s to 1930s period where here we're struggling with our modernist fundamentalist controversy. It's swirling around our missionaries, our Presbyterian missionaries that we're sending abroad. And these missionaries abroad are writing reports back to the mothership here in the U.S. Things like how many converts have there been? Like that's how many hospitals, how many schools. They're trying to measure impact from a bureaucratic perspective. And so the head count on conversions is a big deal. Okay, that's one perspective. What might ethnography say about conversion, this theological category of someone who did not previously know about Christianity, did not self-identify as a Christian, but now confesses Jesus is Lord, just like the Presbyterian missionary? Like, what do we do with that, given the colonial power structures, the resources at play within this kind of colonial context? And I'm basically asking for a kind of power analysis that ethnography might provide, which complicates conversion as merely assimilation into a head count. Mm-hmm. So, play with that a little bit. There's a lot there, and we'll see where the Spirit leads.
Thinking about your question, first, what does the method of ethnography bring to this question?
Yes.
My response to that is the ethnography and qualitative research writ large, really not just ethnography as a particular type of qualitative research, brings in the voices of those you are talking about. So if we're going to talk about conversion, in specific the conversion experiences of Chinese Christians, then what ethnography and qualitative research does is it brings in their perspective, right? It brings in their experiences. It brings in their understanding in a way that is much thicker than somebody that is only working with archives, that is much thicker than somebody who is just observing them from afar. In a sense, it's a more collective process. I think the beauty of the way that qualitative research is shaping up to be is it's becoming a more participatory process, right? Now, in response to your question about what are the implications of conversion for power and belonging, I would actually take this back to comments I made earlier about translation and the power of local indigenous Christians to make relevant for them what they have received from others. As much as we like to think that Christian missionaries from Europe were simply sharing the faith, as you've noted, they also share European baggage and European controversies and American modernist fundamentalist splits. You can see it all over the archives.
Some of which may be relevant to the Chinese or Indian or Filipino context, and some of which may not be relevant.
Absolutely, but they're bringing that over.
Yep.
They are bringing that over in their missions work. And the reality is that, from my perspective, converts like Chinese Christians, they receive those controversies and they are formed in them. But what ethnography brings is this question of what do they do with it? And I think they do different things with it than perhaps what Europeans or American missionaries might have thought. So they can be sort of grafted into the modernist fundamentalist controversy in the sense that they're taught this is correct doctrine, and those people over there, that's bad doctrine, right? Or those aren't real Christians. We're the real Christians because we believe this or that. Certainly they are, the conversion brings you into that. But once you take those facts, those beliefs, and they enter this Chinese context where, in particular, the Communist Party is a factor that nobody in the United States has to deal with, or Europe has to deal with in the same way. I mean, there are communist parties in the United States,
that's kind of part of the flavor of the Chinese context, that the Anglo-European missionaries are not explicitly contending with.
No, and so what they have to do is they have to take this modernist, fundamentalist inheritance, that they've been converted into to a certain extent, and they take that doctrine, they take those structures, the ecclesial structures that were passed down, and they use them to contend, to negotiate, to work out what's taking place in front of them in their own cultural context. And this is very much true for what is happening in the growing neo-reformed church in China amongst house churches that have very thick connections with neo-reformed groups in the United States, but yet at the same time are from an ethnographic, sort of standpoint of observing the culture, getting engaged with interviews and learning from their own experience, they wield these realities in different ways to deal with their own cultural questions. And so in that sense, they're translating the whole thing over, in both what we think should be translated and things that maybe shouldn't be.
I'm processing that. We can stick with the neo-reformed example that you referred to, or you can pick up, because I'm going to ask you, like, for a case about the messiness of translation, because that's essentially what you were saying. There's stuff that translates, but it's not always a one-to-one translation. So I'm wondering if you can help illustrate the messiness of that translation. I was talking about conversion, because that's an interface between the quote-unquote foreign missionary, the indigenous Chinese. They interact at that event of conversion, but there could be other sort of meeting places where that translation occurs. And here's kind of my test question for whatever case you generate. How would the American Presbyterian write the story of that encounter? And what would the indigenous person say in Mandarin reporting back to their village, so to speak? In other words, same event. How does it get reported? And when you play that telephone connection game, does it come to meet, or does it become really quite different representations of the so-called same event?
That's a very hard question.
Okay, so then
Let me think about it.
Okay.
Well, what comes to mind is let's work with a real tangible and continues to be somewhat controversial question among Christian circles in both the United States as well as in other parts of the world. This issue of inerrancy of Scripture.
Yeah,
I think that's a fair case study to work with. Inerrancy of Scripture has a certain flavor in the fundamentalist modernist conflict in the United States of America among Presbyterians.
J. Greshamation, Westminster Seminary, an entire fracture within the Presbyterian Church and denomination. Letters and volumes and books and institutions were created out of this doctrinal debate as well as other doctrinal debates. Continue.
Absolutely. And of course, this doctrinal debate does get imported into China and gets taught, among missionaries to the letter. And so from there, you would think, oh, well, it's a one-to-one translation. Obviously, Chinese churches are either, teaching inerrancy as important to Scripture and faith, or they're saying, no, the Scripture is not fully inerrant. We have some flexibility in working with that, right? So same issues, right? I think that's true, but there's other layers behind it, and ethnographic qualitative research can get to those layers in a way that you wouldn't be able to, because it has to do with the cultural context of China after the communist revolution, right? Because after the communist revolution, if we're going to play with this case study, most of the mainline missionary institutions, the schools, the seminaries, they were grafted into a larger communist front line. So this is where the Three Self Patriotic Movement and the China Christian Council, the state registered church, is sort of used as a shorthand for this institution of the church. They inherit all of these mainline sort of institutions. And their interest is, how do I make the church palatable, even collaborative with the Communist Party? it has to be done, because if we don't do it, our institutions are done for. Okay?
So for institutional survival in China, there had to be some type of cooperation with the Communist Party.
Right. And you know what's a convenient way to do that functionally is to say, no, look at Scripture. We're not going to be completely inerrant about it. Scripture has lots of space to to explore possibilities of working with communist, principles
So the Three
and
Self Church
ideologies.
in China was non-inerrantist.
Generally, generally
Generally speaking.
speaking, there were plenty of evangelical fundamentalists who decided to side with the Three Self
So,
as well. But generally, yes.
so then that would get cashed out from an American modernist fundamentalist paradigm as liberal.
Yeah. So, the registered church in China is liberal. And then what you see in the churches that chose not to become registered, who chose to be against the communist system and wanted to stay true to their faith, right? They tended to adopt that more inerrant scripture perspective because it was a way to distinguish themselves apart from uh, the communist influenced church, so they would see it, right? The not true church. So inerrancy became it's still the same doctrine, but like I've said earlier, it gets translated in such a way that it gets wielded to deal with different problems, right? And so they wanted to be they wanted to be set apart from the emerging structures of a communist overseen church, and inerrancy was a nice way to distinguish themselves apart from that, and that factor is it's I don't know if any Chinese Christian would explicitly make that the main point. But if you do the observation, the ethnographic work surrounding the emergence of and the way that people talk and relate, it's in the air. However, to your point about how would this get written in the United States of America, they might not write anything about communist identity and theological resonance and debates as part of that. They might just write about it in terms of like, look, they believe this and we believe this now, and we're all one group. So it's definitely multiple levels.
Yeah. Right. What's emerging from this part of our conversation is just because two groups may confess identical doctrines, it doesn't mean the doctrine is doing the same exact work for both groups.
Absolutely true. In fact, they often can be doing completely different work.
So that might be a clever note to end this conversation on. There's so much more that we can pick up at a later date. But Easten, I'm so grateful for this chance to talk about migration and global Christianity, to talk about your future work getting published on Chinese Christianity. Any closing thoughts from you?
I just want to thank you, David, for the way that you have convened these types of conversations. These kinds of conversations that bring together sort of a thick analytical theological eye with lived experiences and your interest in the Asian American church. In doing so, I think you're opening up new conversations that generally don't happen. When I look at the landscape of theology and Asian American Christianity and research into that, there's definitely a move toward migration and Transpacific relationships, but spaces to talk about the theological implications of these Transpacific realities, I think are still far and in between. And I think you are carving out a space for that in a way that is really meaningful. And I hope that listeners to your podcasts, viewers of your lectures, attendees of your conference can see how special that is. A place where where our theology is fully engaged with the messiness of Asian and Asian American life. So.
That's a great word. Thank you for your kind words, Easten, and I hope that this conversation grows. Till next time.